This lesson is pertaining to disaster risk reduction and its strategies. The major purpose of this lesson is to introduce and orient aims, concepts, formula, process and approaches of disaster risk reduction. Moreover, this lesson illustrates the aims, concepts of disaster risk reduction strategies, forms of strategies and conceptual framework. It also describes community based risk reduction, micro level strategies in disaster risk reduction. This presentation has been made to explain the relationship between disaster risk reduction and sustainable development goals and the guiding principles in implementing disaster risk reduction strategies. Objectives of this lesson. On completion of this lesson, you will be able to illustrate various strategies in disaster risk reduction, orient and implementation related activities on disaster risk reduction at micro and macro levels, making relationship between disaster risk reduction, sustainable development goals for sustainable development, driving guides and principles of disaster risk reduction strategies. Now, let us look into the meaning of disaster. Disaster means an occurrence causing widespread destructions and distress in the land surface. At present, the disaster risks are gradually increasing worldwide. Mostly disasters are related to nature and climatic conditions. Those are earthquake, floods, landsliding, cyclones, wildfire and storms. Most of the living people and livestock, fertile lands and environmental conditions are affected by the above mentioned disasters in developing countries. The countries attained 80% of the economic losses due to the disaster events and incidents. The poor countries or the developing countries are facing vulnerabilities and various hazards due to low capacities of the communities and the systems in risk reduction measures. Moreover, the development efforts are increasingly at risk. Lack of proper urban planning, poor urban governance, land management, vulnerable rural livelihoods and declining ecosystems, life pattern of the communities, new scientific inventions and climate changes are evidence based expansion of disaster risk in India. The Disaster Management Act 2005 provides policy framework for dealing with vulnerability, natural hazards and threats. Based on this act, all the states and union territories have developed disaster management plans according to the geographical areas and disaster risks. Moreover, under the guidance of Disaster Management Act, all the districts have established district community based disaster preparedness plan to mitigate and prevention of natural disasters. The National Disaster Policy gives guidance and relevant set of actions. It includes various institutions such as National Institute of Disaster Management, National Disaster Management Authority, State Disaster Management Authorities and District Disaster Management Authorities. What is disaster risk reduction? Disaster risk reduction is a systematic and scientific approach for identifying, assessing and reducing the risks of disasters in particular areas. Disaster risk reduction explains application of policy, strategies and practices that minimize hazards, vulnerabilities and disaster risks throughout a society. The conceptual framework of elements considered with the possibilities to minimize vulnerabilities and disaster risks throughout a society to avoid or to limit the adverse impacts of hazards within the broad context of sustainable development. Aims and the concept of disaster risk reduction. The aim of disaster risk reduction is to diminish the socio-economic vulnerabilities to disasters and dealing with environmental hazards and threats. Besides, the disaster risk reduction targets to minimize the damages caused by the natural hazards as well as man-made disasters. The concept of disaster risk reduction is practice of reducing disaster risks by means of systematic efforts and intervention to analyze and reduce factors of disasters. The examples of disaster risk reduction are reducing exposure to hazard threats, diminishing vulnerability of people, sustaining natural resources, environment and management, improving preparedness of the community, and establishing early warnings related to earthquakes, floods, drought and cyclones. Now, let us look into the concept of disaster risk reduction strategies. A disaster risk reduction strategy is to help the community to become more resilient to hazards and thus reduce the likelihood that their development may be undermined by one or more disasters. It explains the relationship between disaster risk reduction interventions, development programming and a focus on building resilience based on density of disaster. Examples of disaster risk reduction strategies are related to improving preparedness for inimical events, minimizing exposure to hazards and threats, reducing vulnerability to people and existing resources, strategic management for land and environment, aims and scope of disaster risk reduction strategies. The aim of disaster risk reduction strategies is to reduce risks and prevent new risks, empower sustainability, including the country's responsibility to prevent and mitigate the disaster risks, and engagement of the whole society and government institutions. The scope of disaster risk reduction strategies is significantly expanded and focused on the natural risks and environmental and technological related risks in India. Disaster risk reduction strategies also protect nature and resources for human beings. Formula for disaster risk reduction: reducing vulnerabilities and understanding hazard lead to reducing disaster risks. The international strategy for disaster reduction. UNISDR is a system aimed to generate and support a global disaster risk reduction movement. Besides, this system has developed culture of prevention for sustainable development in the society. Prevention is an essential component in disaster risk reduction strategies. Why disaster risk reduction strategies? Every community is at risk from natural hazards, which creates an urgent need for public policies and strategic plans to prevent, mitigate and prepare for the inevitable. In addition, that the disaster risk reduction strategies are an investment to protect human lives and to avoid economic losses. Now, let us look at the process of disaster risk reduction. It begins with prevention and mitigation, followed by preparedness, prediction, warning and evacuation, adaptation, emergency responses, recovery and monitoring. Prevention and mitigation. A prevention plan reduces the risk of disaster and minimize the loss of human beings and resources in the disaster prone areas. Prevention and disaster plan ensure the sustainable results in vulnerable mapping areas. The community and target people involvement is needed in prevention process. Mitigation is an effective activity to reduce the ill effects of disaster. Vulnerability analysis, hazard mapping, flood plan mapping and public education are supportive for effective mitigation process in disaster risk reduction. Preparedness. Preparedness aims to reduce the risks in the location of disaster risk areas and to involve in communication, information and warning systems. Preparedness planning is aimed to establish a capacity to respond to situations that affect a country or region by putting in place preparedness measures. Some examples are early warning systems, vulnerability assessment in disaster prone areas and capacity building in hazard mapping and disaster awareness programs. Prediction, warning and evacuation. Disaster brings great damages, destruction and devastation of human beings as well as natural resources. The process of prediction and warning system prevents economic losses and diminishes damages in the community. Prediction and warning communicates alertness on floods, wildfires and so on. Early warning is a systematic collection and analysis of information in identification of emergencies and crises in disaster prone areas. Adaptation. The community has to follow adaptation process to accommodate their livelihood and crisis situations. Emergency response. It gives immediate response and assistance to the people who under hazardous situations and risks generally after the disaster occurs. The emergency response plan elicits risk assessments and scenarios of emergency. Besides, the emergency response is more important during and after disaster period. First aid, safety medical care, drinking water, food and shelter are included in emergency response in disaster management. Recovery. Recovery decisions and actions are very important in the process of disaster risk reduction. The disaster recovery is to enable the process to follow a set of actions, procedures to relieve from risks. Recovery action supports to restore and resilience of the affected community. Recovery process is an opportunity to develop and apply disaster risk reduction measures. Monitoring. After recovery, monitoring systems are needed to monitor ongoing activities for resilience. Strategies of disaster risk reduction. This aspect suggests some key strategies according to Indian context. Preparing hazard mapping, conducting the mapping activities related to earthquake areas, flooding areas, drought areas and its seasons, landslides, tsunami and mapping severe environmental degradation. Identification of vulnerability. It is another strategy in disaster risk reduction. This strategy identifies disaster prone areas, risks of disaster and support of community, need of stakeholders and coordination from disaster management authorities. Education on disaster risk reduction. It imparts many know-how techniques to save the people and resources from the risks of disaster. Education of disaster risk reduction brings right attitude and behavioral changes among the people with vulnerability in disaster areas. The micro and macro level teaching process are needed in disaster risk reduction education. The steps are important in educating disaster risk reduction. Those are: step 1, understand the window of opportunity. Step 2, hear the hazards and vulnerabilities. Step 3, identify the period. Step 4, act and implement. Prevention and mitigation. It is one of the precautionary strategies to prevent hazards in disaster prone areas. Preparedness plan prevents damages from the wildfires and lessening the natural hazards in the forest and hilly areas. While adopting strategies of prevention and mitigation, it reduces the frequency of events, intensity and impacts of threats and hazards. Capacity development of the communities. Capacity building of the community is a way for sustainability in community resilience and restoration of resources in disaster prone areas. The national and state disaster management authorities have to conduct evidence based training programs to the community, committees and implementing partners related to disaster management. Advocacy. Disaster management related advocacy is to be started from the community to the policy levels. The advocacy strategy is influencing the issues on social, political, economic and environment contributions. An advocacy strategy supports to strengthen and rectify the disaster policy for the welfare of the society. Awareness campaigning. This strategy creates mass awareness about disasters and its implications. The disaster management knowledge is increased while conducting awareness campaigning activities among public. Community education programs. Community education should be appropriate to native and disaster prone areas. Besides, community education program promotes resilience and new systems in disaster risk reduction. Networking. Networking is a key strategy in disaster risk reduction for mobilizing resources and tapping the resources from local to global levels. Conceptual framework for disaster risk reduction strategies. Disaster risk reduction strategies, an Indian model. The model begins with risk assessment at the community level. Both scientific information and information by the local community at local level is gathered. Second stage, dialogues and discussion. Experts discuss about disaster management, participation of various stakeholders in disaster risk reduction. The third stage, action and acting on disaster risk reduction. Action by the government or national disaster management authorities or state disaster management authorities. People follow the action for remedial and reduction measures. Approaches for disaster risk reduction. Disaster seriously disrupts human life, livelihood, economic system, political scenario in the society. Based on the experience and learnings, we try to understand the fivefold approaches in disaster risk reduction. Those are political, technical, socio-educational, development and humanitarian approaches. Political approach. The political approach creates political will in prevention of disaster risks and welfare of people after disaster events. Besides, the political approach is path to reframe the national disaster policy to develop new policy and amendments based on the disaster prone areas. This approach ensures allocation of sufficient resources in prevention of disaster and recovery phase. The technical approach. This approach is pertaining to science and technology. Early warning devices, systems that are developed through technical approach, and this approach guides and facilitates in assessment of risks and hazards, monitoring, mitigation process, identifying disaster prone or vulnerable areas through mapping. The socio-educational approach. This approach creates responsibilities and commitments of the community in disaster risk reduction. The socio-educational approach imparts community based education in disaster prone areas, creating awareness, skill development for safety and resilience of the community. The implementing agencies are having vital role in promotion of socio-educational or disaster risk reduction. The development approach. This approach tries to integrate policy, legislative measures with support of technology. The development approach covers developmental planning and welfare programs with long-term vision. Examples are establishment of infrastructure, equipment development, promoting afforestation, satellite development to share information to the global level. The National Disaster Management Authority and State Disaster Management Authorities are adopting development approach in disaster risk reduction. The public-private partnership is to be added to strengthen developmental approach. The humanitarian approach. This approach is to save community people in phases of response and recovery. The community participation is needed with humanitarian touch without any caste, race, gender, color, etc. while implementing any disaster management schemes. What can we do for disaster risk reduction? Disaster risk reduction is a part of disaster management and sustainable development. The planned developmental activities are diminishing risks and hazards in disaster significantly. In another aspect, unsound national disaster policy may increase more disaster related losses and risks in vulnerable areas. Disaster risk reduction is a vast area to work for prevention, mitigation and recovery phase. There is a need of participation from the individuals, community, society, government sector, non-governmental sector, private partners, implementing agencies, monitoring committees and technical professional from the disaster management authorities. the people have the following roles in the below mentioned areas: identifying and pointing out risky areas within disaster prone areas, mapping and measuring high risk areas to avoid natural degradation, educating the people with vulnerability and hazardous areas about prevention and mitigation aspects in disaster management, imparting and developing skills on disaster mitigation, alertness and response and recovery contents, motivating community people in relief and rehabilitation activities after providing basic needs to the people who are affected by the disaster by means of awareness creation and sensitization programs, disseminating relevant information to the disaster management authorities from the regional to state level, preparing people in resource mobilization and establishing a community chest. Here the chest means the committee is responsible for mobilization and utilization of resources in the form of man, money, material and time. Maintaining primary health care, sanitation, hygiene after disaster events. After earthquake, tsunami and fire accidents, the community takes the overall responsibilities for environment, hygiene and sanitation. Training and equipping the health care providers against epidemics and communicable diseases. Strengthening institutional and legislative arrangements based on disaster management policies. Providing financial protection for people and businesses at risk. Integrating disaster risk reduction across multiple sectors including health, environment and agriculture. Promoting the partners in collaborative efforts and establishing partner coordination network. The following partner coordination network is possible with local government, non-profit sector, state government, private sector and community members. Micro level strategies in disaster risk reduction. The micro level strategies are very effective and save a number of lives and environmental resources positively. The strategies followed at the level of individual, group, family, community and society. Some micro level strategies are illustrated here. Ranking and prioritizing the forms of disaster in disaster prone areas. The examples are flood areas, landsliding areas, zone for wildfires and zone of high level pollution. Assessing the range of disaster and establishing disaster rescue volunteer teams for providing essential services and rescue works. Organizing sensitization meetings for all segments of the people such as children, adolescents, women, senior citizens to the nature of disaster and its impact in the community. Arranging workshops on mitigation activity to train and equip community people and all those involving in the training personnel during and after disaster. Recognizing, prioritizing and planning the first line disaster and basic root causes of disaster with support of state disaster management authorities. The examples are construction of check dams to prevent flood damages, tree plantation against climate change and pollutions, strengthening community resources, community chest to manage the funds and expenses in prevention efforts, mitigation plans, immediate response works and rehabilitation activities according to disaster events. Ensuring resources in the way of human and financial for human protection and sustainable environment. Forming and strengthening the teams under disaster management such as early warning team, search and rescue team, team for providing basic needs, medical care team, relief and rehabilitation team and team for counseling. Disaster risk reduction and sustainable development goal. The disaster is significantly harmful to human race, environment and nature, especially in disaster prone areas in the developing countries. Disaster is a universal threat to lives and affect the livelihood of the people. The sustainable development goals are having greater platform to adopt and implement disaster risk reduction strategies to prevent and mitigate its impact. The SDGs focus core development strategies in disaster management. Moreover, the Sustainable Development Goal recognizes urgent needs to minimize the disaster risks through concrete strategies. Besides, the Sendai framework is having specific scope and opportunities to attain Sustainable Development Goal activities. The goals 9 and 13 are more relevant in disaster risk reduction strategies towards sustainable development. These goals are concentrating on the vulnerability of the poor and reduce exposures to hazards and disaster events. The Sustainable Development Goal number 9 is pertaining to promote resilient infrastructures, including sustainable industrialization. Some infrastructures are laying down surface roads for barrier-free transportation, installation of electric and solar power for power supply, improving communication through communications for dissemination purpose, and establishment of water supply network for safe drinking water to the disaster prone areas. When failures occur in these infrastructures, it can interrupt vital services and creates threat to environmental sustainability. Similarly, Sustainable Development Goal number 13 is strongly concentrating on climate change and its ill effects. This goal illustrates to take urgent and necessary action against climate change. Most of the evidences and reality have expressed the relationship between climate change and risks of disaster at global level. However, these Sustainable Development Goals number 9 and 13 target timely intervention. Following disaster risk measures, strategic planning to combat disasters impact in the disaster prone regions. The Sendai framework is having a clear vision 2015 to 2030 to adopt disaster risk reduction strategies at national level. Guiding principles for implementing disaster risk reduction strategies. This suggests few guiding principles for effective implementation of disaster risk reduction strategies at national context. Those are identification, that is identifying vulnerable groups and areas through mapping, formation, that is forming various committees in the process of disaster management, capacity building, that is strengthening various stakeholders and community through comprehensive training programs, planning, that is preparing clear blueprint on need assessment, objectives, program planning, intervention strategies, resources and the time period. Implementation, that is taking action and implementing programs based on disaster implications. Intervention, that is doing timely intervention based on the community and area context. Decentralization, decentralizing powers, roles and responsibilities from the disaster management authority to community level. Coordination, that is bringing effective coordination with various networking organizations and systems. Community participation, it is ensuring community participation in all the phases of disaster management. Partnership, establishing a public private partnership in disaster related activities. Summary of the lesson. The aim of disaster risk reduction strategies are to find the meaningful way to reduce the risk at maximum level. The community based disaster risk reduction is very relevant to Indian context. Moreover, disaster risk reduction strategies had numerous associated activities during the implementation at micro and macro levels. The guiding principles lead to understand the disaster risk reduction strategies at all levels.